This is the first Sunday of Advent. Christmas is still a ways off. This is Advent, the secret to good Christmas. For hundreds of years, Advent has been a 4-week season of preparation for Jesus coming again to us, helping us to live lives with renewed purpose and vision. It's the cry of the human heart through the increasing darkness of these days, calling out for Jesus to once again be born in us. It's a season filled with miracle, leading finally, after the soul work is done, to hearing again angelic choirs in the nighttime sky. This year, we are invited again to consciously, meaningfully, intentionally anticipate this. This morning we began a 4-week sermon series titled City of Angels, which I believe has little to do with Los Angeles, which is a great relief to me because I'm one of those who have not yet forgiven Los Angeles for stealing the Dodgers. I realize I dated myself there. No, what we will be looking at in this season are 4 angelic appearances associated with announcing the birth of Jesus, beginning this morning with the angel to Zechariah, as recorded in Luke chapter 1, verses 5 to 25. This is the story. 2,000 years ago, there was a priest in the hill country of Judah whose name was Zechariah. He and his wife, Elizabeth, were well along in years, and both were good people, rare in observing all of God's commands and regulations blamelessly. They had no children, and now it was doubtful whether they ever would. One day it fell to Zechariah to burn the incense in the holy place in the temple at Jerusalem. And the strangest thing happened to him. The temple, of course, could have a strange effect on a person. It wasn't like Zechariah often offered incense in it. Likely he had never done it before. Your turn as a priest came up by lot, and some priest would never get to do this. And so Zechariah is there, all alone in the holy place, just a step or two from the forbidden Holy of Holies, just the curtain between. And he casts the incense in the fire, and what does he see through the hiss of the incense and the rise of the smoke? Is it an angel? Perhaps it's a trance, perhaps hallucination. He is enveloped in the smell of incense. But the angel speaks and promises him a son, specifically to be named John. And that is not all. The boy will be great in the sight of the Lord. He will be filled with the Holy Spirit, and he will bring many of the people of Israel back to the Lord their God. Zechariah, not surprisingly, isn't convinced. How can I be sure of this, he asks. And because he questioned the angel, who turned out to be the great Gabriel, he was struck mute, unable to speak until the birth of a child. And that is the story of the angel to Zechariah. My focus today, however, is on how the story goes on. Now in Luke chapter 1, beginning in verse 57. His wife Elizabeth did become pregnant, and when the boy was born, the neighbors and relatives assumed that he would be named after his father, Zechariah. After all, Zechariah was a holy man, and all agreed that he had seen a vision. But Zechariah insisted in writing that his name was John, and immediately he could speak again. And the first thing he did was break forth in praise of God in a psalm we call, from the Latin, praise be the Benedictus. Zechariah had had a lot of time to think. A lot of things become clear when for 9 months you can't talk. He knows something big is up. In addition to the angel and the 9 months of silence, there is his own name, Zechariah. An angel has appeared to a priest named Zechariah. If you were to turn to the end of the Old Testament, to the second last book, the first 6 chapters, you'd find another priest named, catch this, Zechariah, to whom an angel appears at length. And it's not an accident. It's a connection we miss, but a priest back then wouldn't have. Zechariah could hear the echoes. Life was filled with archetypes. It was always repeating itself. And he would feel a shiver running down his spine because he would know that God is back. The big story is picking up. But what is it? What does God have planned now? Zechariah thinks and thinks and thinks. He sees his country trodden underfoot by the Romans, subject to the whims of Rome. He sees a Sadducean high priesthood, corrupt and compromised, known to collaborate with Rome. He knows the contempt of the Sadducees for the Pharisees, and of the Pharisees for the Sadducees, and of the Essenes for the Sadducees and the Pharisees, and of the Zealots for all three. It's a nation religiously devouring itself, each little group claiming to be right with God, claiming to speak for God, and looking down contemptuously on everyone else. And none of them are in touch with life the way ordinary people live it. And you couldn't even go to the temple to feel right with God. In fact, you couldn't enter the temple without realizing how bad things really were. You had to press your way through the hawking and the hustling of the money changers. You knew their scales were dishonest. They preyed on pilgrims. It was a travesty. And everywhere there was violence, noise, and conflict. The cries of injustice from an occupied people, the hideous noise of competing religious creeds, the chaos in the temple courts, the quick flash of a zealot sword finding its target in the crowded streets of Jerusalem, the roads eventually lined with crosses and hanging bodies. And as Zechariah, in these long months of silence, ponders the meaning of his son's birth and the birth of the baby to be born to Mary, he figures out what it's all about. And he breaks forth an inspired prophecy, traditionally called the Benedictus, beginning in Luke chapter 1, verse 68. And he sings of redemption and salvation and the ability to serve God without fear. And he sings of forgiveness, that God will give his people the knowledge of salvation through the forgiveness of their sins. But then he comes to the climax, at the very end in verse 79. All this will happen, the birth of his son John and the birth of Mary's child, to guide our feet into the path of peace. The problem, of course, is that 2,000 years later, it doesn't really seem to have happened. In the words of the third verse of It Came Upon a Midnight Clear, beneath the angel's strain have rolled 2,000 years of wrong, and men at war with men hear not the love song which they bring. And now, in addition to hotspots all around the world, we have the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And though Ukraine has proven resourceful and resilient beyond all expectation, winter is coming, winter is there, with everywhere power outages and death-dealing missiles aimed at infrastructure, hospitals, children, and residential buildings. Here at home, we see in our own politics anger beyond reason, polarization, endless grievance, senseless aggression, and in place of the common welfare, our own Game of Thrones. Why? Why do any folks think any of this is okay? Now, here's the truth. Here's the gospel. As another angel proclaimed in Luke chapter 2, here is the good news of great joy that's for all the people. From the very beginning, the messianic agenda has always been peace. As Zechariah sings, it happens to guide our feet into the path of peace. As the prophet Isaiah envisioned, one day swords will be beat into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks. One day a child will be born, and he will be called the Prince of Peace. And of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end. And one day the wolf will live peaceably with the lamb. One day Jesus stood overlooking the city of Jerusalem, and he wept in Luke chapter 19:41, lamenting, "If you, even you, had only known what would bring you peace." And one day Peter told the household of Cornelius, now in Acts chapter 10, verse 36, about the message that God sent to the people of Israel, the good news of peace through Jesus Christ. And we have to ask if we've missed something, missed what it was all about. Have we divided over things that Jesus would not have wasted a breath over? Fought when we should have tried to understand one another? Condemned when we should have forgiven? Argued when we should have steadied? Steadied when we should have got up from the table and washed one another's feet? It's hard to miss the fact that with the coming of the Messiah, Zechariah expected peace, and Luke expected peace, and Jesus expected peace, Isaiah expected peace. So what do we do as Christians, as Christ's church, as one of Christ's gatherings on earth? Peace is never easy. Peace requires sacrifice and moral imagination. Making real peace may cost far more than even war. But still, perhaps it begins with just one thing. And this is it. It's astonishingly simple, really, but it's something to which no sizable group has ever been really committed. And that is to learn to do what Jesus asks of us, and catch this, to demand it of no one else. That is to go back to what Jesus centrally asked of his disciples, as stated nowhere clearer than in the Sermon on the Mount. To love our enemies, to recognize that reconciliation is more important even than worship, to create within ourselves a spirit of non-retaliation, to turn the other cheek, to go the second mile, to give to the one who asks of us, to forgive others as God forgives us, to extend to others the grace that we reserve for ourselves, to extend to your husband, your wife, your parents, your sons or daughters, your friend who has disappointed you, who has hurt your feelings, your difficult boss, the enemy who is out to hurt you, to extend to them the same grace we reserve for ourselves. To not even be angry with one another, to trust our Father in heaven, to really trust him, and thereby let go of our need to have things always go our way. I'm assuming that Jesus really meant these things. Meant them for my protection, meant them because they work, meant them because they create peace on earth. Yet we usually sort of dismiss them offhandedly, as if all these things were secondary. Nice if you could get to them, but not really the substance, something to do after you get all the doctrine and everyone else straightened out. Matthew, inspired by God, describes these things as being the most fundamental to a follower of Jesus. Yes, Jesus is saying, if you're following me, I really do expect you to learn these things and then do them. To not even be angry with one another. To keep your marriage covenant until you die. To not look at anyone lustfully. To turn the other cheek. To learn these things. To go the second mile. To love even your enemies. To forgive those who sin against you. To trust your Heavenly Father every day in everything. I really do expect your righteousness to surpass the most rigorous standards of anyone else. And I'm going to ask one more thing from you, to not demand it of anyone else, even perhaps to not expect it from anyone else. I'm going to ask you, remember Jesus, not to judge. That's what comes at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. Only then, when we do what Jesus asks of us and quit expecting it from everybody else, our children or our work associates, our neighbors or our national leaders, our husbands or wives or parents, or even our fellow Christians. Only then will people be empowered by both our example and the freedom that we lovingly give them to learn to do the right thing. And only then is it done in peace, and will it lead to peace and to a future we can trust. Only then will we avoid all the moralizing, the charges and countercharges, the poisonous expectations, cruel disappointments, the bitter recriminations, and the predictable self-justifications that make peace impossible. Jesus came to guide our feet into the path of peace. He came to bring good news of great joy for all the people. And to achieve this, he asked his disciples, first, to learn to do what is right, and it does take learning, and second, to quit expecting it from everyone else. Of course, this runs counter to what we do, diametrically counter, and almost none of us are good at this. And even if we get it right for a while, we slip back. What we do is expect others to always do the right thing. And we grant ourselves exemption after exemption. There's always a reason why we couldn't do it, couldn't get it right, and when we got it right, couldn't keep it right. We were too busy, too distracted, too overwhelmed, too confused, too scarred. And of course, then we should know what's happening to everybody else. Christianity has never gotten this right, and after 2,000 years, it's probably time to admit it. Yep. There's a story, perhaps apocryphal, that's told of Gandhi. He was asked once what he thought of Christianity, and he answered, it'd probably be a great idea if anyone ever tried it. But it takes levels of awareness and dedication that we have seldom asked of ourselves before. The church cannot just be a place that makes us feel a little religious. A part of our life that we pay attention to when all our other priorities are taken care of. When we feel good about almost every other area in our life, when we've addressed every other concern. Instead, the church must be a place of spiritual formation that changes us into what we otherwise would not be, where we learn things that transform us, where we learn how to live lives of love, where we bond together with companions strong enough to travel the path of peace. It takes both a commitment to decisive goodness and a kindness to those who can't or won't make such a commitment, or perhaps who haven't yet made such a commitment. There's hardly ever been in the history of the church a group of people, a sizable group over an extended period of time, who lived themselves by the highest standards imaginable and resolutely refused to judge those who did not. When that truth is learned, when such a movement, such a group gathers, they will be following our teacher in the path of peace. May you never forget this secret hidden in plain sight. Many Christmases ago, I came across the writing of an artist poet, Brian Andreas, from which I offer this excerpt. In my dreams, the angels shrugged and said, "If we fail this time, it will be a failure of imagination." And she placed the world in the palm of my hand, in the palm of our hands. But if we fail this time, it will be a failure of imagination. The call this morning is to make this commitment, to do what Jesus asks of you, all that he asks of you, and to resolutely not demand it from anyone else, to quit expecting it from everyone else. It will create a whole new world. Your hope will create hopeful people. Your trust will create trustworthy people. Your love will create loving people. It will give you back your wife. It may give you back your father. It will restore your family. It will restore your soul. And one day, it will create peace in our nation and peace on earth.